What would it take to make a 15-foot great white, the ocean's most feared hunter, look like prey? And if such a moment were captured on camera, would you trust what you're seeing? Or would it force you to question everything you thought you knew about the deep? Out in the isolated cobalt waters surrounding Guadalupe Island, the kind of place where the horizon feels endless and the ocean seems almost too vast to fully comprehend, a group of experienced divers set out for what was supposed to be routine. They had done this before, many times. Steel cages lowered into the blue, bait lines drifting just enough to attract attention, cameras ready to capture the silent, awe-inspiring movements of one of Earth's most efficient predators. There's a rhythm to these expeditions. The early morning chill. The quiet anticipation. The hum of equipment. The unspoken understanding among the crew that they are stepping into an environment where they are no longer in control. But they trust the process. They trust the data. And most of all, they trust what they think they know. But what happens when something breaks that trust? The first sign that this dive would be different didn't come with a dramatic splash or a sudden surge of movement. It came slowly, almost subtly. A shadow emerging from the depths. A familiar silhouette. A large female great white, easily around 15 feet, gliding with a kind of calm authority that only an apex predator possesses. Her movements were effortless, almost hypnotic, as she circled the cage. At first glance, nothing seemed out of place. The divers inside the cage watched closely, cameras rolling, their breathing steady but focused. This was what they came for. And then someone noticed it. A mark. It wasn't obvious at first. Just a distortion along her midsection. But as she turned slightly, the angle of the light changed, and suddenly, it became impossible to ignore. A scar. Not jagged. Not irregular. But disturbingly precise. A near-perfect circular bite wrapping around her torso, as though something had clamped down with incredible force and then let go. The edges were defined, the pattern unmistakable. Rows of punctures, evenly spaced, forming a curve that seemed almost too symmetrical to be real. The diver nearest the front of the cage leaned closer, instinctively, as if proximity would somehow make it easier to understand what he was seeing. His camera captured everything. Every detail. Every line of that wound. And in that moment, a question began to form, one that no one could immediately answer. How does something like that happen? The shark continued her slow pass, unbothered, almost indifferent to the attention. But for those watching, something had shifted. The experience was no longer just about observation. It had become something else entirely. Something unsettling. Because the size of the bite didn't make sense. Take a moment to picture it clearly. A great white shark, already massive by any standard, bearing a wound that appeared larger than its own head. The geometry alone was enough to disrupt any comfortable explanation. If a creature like that, built to hunt, to dominate, to survive, can be marked in such a way, what kind of force leaves that behind? When the dive ended, the mood aboard the boat was different. Quieter. More focused. Footage was reviewed almost immediately. Frame by frame. Angles compared. Measurements estimated. And with every replay, the same realization grew stronger. This wasn't an anomaly you could easily dismiss. One of the divers, someone who had spent years documenting great whites, couldn't shake the image. She had seen scars before, evidence of territorial disputes, failed hunts, even encounters with human activity. But this was something else. This wasn't random damage. It looked deliberate. Which raises an uncomfortable question. What kind of encounter produces a wound like that, and still allows the shark to survive? The boat's captain, a veteran of these waters with decades of experience, didn't rush to conclusions. He had seen enough over the years to know that the ocean doesn't always offer clear answers. But he also knew when something deserved attention. Quietly, without drawing unnecessary speculation, he documented the footage and sent it to a network of marine researchers. And then something unexpected happened. Not all of the divers were eager to go back in the water the next day. Think about that. These were not amateurs. These were individuals who had willingly placed themselves within feet of great whites on multiple occasions. Fear was not unfamiliar to them, but it was usually manageable, contained within the boundaries of known risk. So why hesitate now? Unless the situation had shifted from known risk to unknown threat. To understand the significance of the wound, It helps to look at the biology of great white sharks. These animals are engineered for survival in a way that few creatures are. Their skin, covered in microscopic dermal denticles, acts like natural armor, reducing drag, increasing speed, and providing protection against damage. Their musculature is dense and powerful, capable of explosive bursts of speed. In other words, they are not easy targets, which makes the presence of such a clean, deep, and extensive bite even more difficult to explain. Sharks do bite each other. It happens during competition, during mating, during moments of aggression. But those bites are usually quick, targeted, and rarely symmetrical. They're warnings. Displays of dominance. This wound didn't look like a warning. It looked like an attempt to grip, to hold, possibly even to consume. So now the question becomes unavoidable. If this was an act of predation, what was the predator? There is, of course, one well-documented hunter of great whites, the orca. Known for their intelligence and cooperative hunting strategies, orcas have been observed targeting sharks in certain regions, often with remarkable efficiency. Entire populations of great whites have been known to vacate areas following repeated orca encounters. But here's where the mystery deepens. Orca attacks leave a very specific signature. Their bites are crushing, often accompanied by tearing. They don't leave neat, circular impressions. And their hunting strategy typically involves targeting soft areas, flipping the shark to induce tonic immobility, and removing nutrient-rich organs like the liver. The wound on this shark didn't match that pattern. It wasn't torn. It wasn't ragged. It was precise, which suggests something else entirely. Something with teeth more like a shark's, serrated, uniform, designed for cutting rather than crushing. But significantly larger. How much larger? Based on rough estimates from the footage, the diameter of the bite suggested a jaw span that could only belong to something in the range of 25 to 30 feet in length. And that's where things become difficult. Because according to current scientific understanding, sharks of that size don't exist anymore. Yes, there are historical records. Fossil evidence. Creatures that once ruled ancient oceans with dimensions that dwarf even the largest great whites alive today. But those belong to the past. Extinct. Gone. Or at least, that's what we believe. So what are the possibilities? Could it be an unusually large great white, far beyond documented limits? If so, why has no one reliably recorded such a specimen before? In an age of satellite tracking, underwater drones, and global research networks, how could something that large remain unseen? Or could it be something else entirely? A species rarely encountered, operating in deeper waters, far below the reach of most human exploration? And if that's the case, how often do such encounters happen, without us ever knowing? The ocean covers more than 70% of our planet, and much of it remains unexplored. Vast regions exist where light never penetrates, where pressure alone makes human access nearly impossible. It's easy to forget how little we truly understand about what lives there. So when evidence surfaces, however rare or ambiguous, that challenges our assumptions, it forces us to confront a simple truth. We don't know everything. Back on the boat, as the footage continued to be analyzed, one thought lingered among the crew. Not spoken loudly, but present nonetheless. If something capable of inflicting that kind of wound is out there, is this an isolated incident? Or is it just the only one we've happened to notice? Because consider this, the shark survived. The wound had healed. Which means the encounter wasn't recent. It happened sometime before, possibly weeks, months, maybe even longer. Which raises another question. How many other sharks have encountered the same thing, but didn't survive? And if they didn't survive, what evidence would remain? The ocean doesn't preserve stories the way land does. There are no bones left on the surface, no tracks, no clear signs of struggle. What happens beneath the waves often stays there. Unless something like this surfaces. A scar. A mark. A clue. Something that hints at a larger story, just out of reach. In the days that followed, discussions among researchers remained cautious. Hypotheses were proposed, debated, refined. But no single explanation fully accounted for the precision, size, and placement of the wound. And perhaps that's what makes it so compelling. Not just what it shows, but what it suggests. Because at its core, this isn't just about one shark or one mysterious bite. It's about the limits of our understanding. About the assumptions we make when we label something as known or documented. And what happens when those assumptions are challenged. So the next time you think about the ocean's hierarchy, the idea that apex predators rule their world without challenge, pause for a moment and picture that scar again. A 15-foot great white. Powerful. Efficient. Designed by evolution to dominate. And yet, marked. Marked by something larger. Something capable of turning the hunter into the hunted. That single image forces an uncomfortable question into the open. If even the ocean's most iconic predator isn't safe, then what truly sits at the top of the food chain? And more importantly, how much of that chain have we actually seen? The story didn't begin with theories or speculation. It began with a dive. The water was unusually clear that day, stretching into a blue gradient that faded into darkness. Sunlight pierced the upper layers, scattering across particles suspended in the sea, but beyond a certain depth, everything dissolved into shadow. It was the kind of visibility divers dream of, and the kind that can also make you feel exposed. Because when you can see everything, you're also aware of how much you can't. The cage hung steady beneath the boat, metal bars creaking softly with the motion of the swell. Inside, the diver steadied her breathing, camera in hand, eyes scanning the open water. She had done this dozens of times before. Maybe hundreds. But experience doesn't erase instinct. And instinct was telling her something felt off. Not dangerous, not immediately. Just different. Then it appeared. Out of the blue, literally, a shape began to materialize. At first, just a silhouette. Then a form. Then unmistakable detail. A great white. Massive. Graceful. Silent. It moved with that eerie calm that only apex predators possess, its body slicing through the water with minimal effort. There was no rush. No aggression. Just presence. But as it drew closer, something else came into view. A mark. At first glance, it looked like a shadow across its torso. But as the shark angled slightly, the light revealed something far more disturbing. A scar. Not jagged. Not random. Not the kind left by a struggle with prey or a territorial dispute. This was different. It wrapped around the shark's body in a near-perfect arc, wide, clean, almost surgical in appearance. The spacing alone was enough to send a chill through anyone who understood shark anatomy. Because this wasn't just a bite. It was a bite from something with a mouth larger than the shark's own head. The diver froze. For a brief moment, training gave way to pure human reaction. Her mind raced to categorize what she was seeing, to fit it into something known, something explainable. But nothing fit. The shark passed slowly by the cage, indifferent to the observers. It didn't thrash or show signs of distress. If anything, it seemed composed. Which raised an even more unsettling question. What kind of encounter leaves a scar like that, and allows the victim to survive? Back on the boat, the footage was reviewed again and again. Angles were analyzed. Measurements estimated. Comparisons made. The crew wasn't inexperienced. They had seen scars before, plenty of them. Great whites often bear the marks of their lives. Failed hunts, encounters with rivals, even bites from other sharks. But this didn't match anything in their collective experience. Marine biologists who later examined the footage were equally puzzled. Some suggested it could be a bite from another large great white. After all, cannibalism isn't unheard of. But that explanation quickly ran into problems. The geometry didn't align. The size didn't match. The curvature of the bite suggested a jaw structure, different from what they would expect. Others proposed an orca interaction. Killer whales are known to attack sharks, even flipping them to induce tonic immobility. But again, the evidence didn't fully support it. Orca bites tend to be more chaotic, more destructive. This scar was too clean, too precise. So the question remained, what did this? This is where the conversation begins to shift, from observation into possibility. Because when known explanations fall short, the mind naturally turns toward the unknown. One idea that circulates quietly among researchers is the existence of what some call ghost giants. These wouldn't be mythical creatures or entirely new species, but rather older, larger individuals of known species, sharks that have outgrown typical patterns of behavior. Instead of staying in coastal feeding grounds where most studies occur, they move into deeper waters. Colder, darker, less explored. Out there, far below the reach of most human activity, they live longer, grow larger, and, most importantly, remain unseen. If such individuals exist, how would we ever confirm them? Would we stumble upon them directly? Or would we only ever see the evidence they leave behind, like scars on other predators? Then there's the concept of deep-sea gigantism. It's a well-documented phenomenon in marine biology. In extreme environments, high pressure, low temperatures, minimal light, some species evolve to grow far larger than their shallow water relatives. Giant squids, colossal isopods, enormous amphipods. Nature, it seems, has no problem scaling up when conditions allow. So what happens when you apply that concept to sharks? Could a species we already know, like a sleeper shark or another deep-water predator, reach sizes far beyond what we've recorded? And if so, what would it take to leave a mark on a 15-foot great white? But inevitably, the conversation drifts further into more controversial territory. Because there's one name that refuses to disappear, no matter how many times science declares it settled. Megalodon, a prehistoric giant, officially extinct for over 3 million years. A creature estimated to reach lengths of 50 to 60 feet, with a bite force powerful enough to crush bone effortlessly. To most scientists, the case is closed. The fossil record ends. The species is gone. But the ocean doesn't preserve evidence the way land does. Large bodies sink, decompose, disappear. And the deeper you go, the harder it becomes to observe anything at all. Which leads to a question that's difficult to ignore. If we've explored only a fraction of the ocean's depths, how can we be completely certain about what isn't there? This isn't about claiming Megalodon still exists. It's about acknowledging the limits of our knowledge. Because certainty requires evidence. And in the deep ocean, evidence is scarce. There's another piece of the puzzle, one that's often overlooked but deeply intriguing. A tagged great white shark, monitored by researchers, suddenly changed its behavior. Without warning, it dove. Not just a routine descent, but a rapid sustained dive into depths far beyond its usual range. Then something strange happened. The temperature reading on the tag spiked dramatically. For a brief period, it recorded conditions far warmer than the surrounding water. Then, silence. The tag stopped transmitting. When researchers later analyzed the data, one explanation stood out. The shark had likely been consumed. Swallowed. Its tag, now inside a predator, briefly recorded the internal temperature of whatever had eaten it. But here's the unsettling part. What kind of predator could do that? What kind of creature could overpower a great white, drag it into the depths, and swallow it whole? At what point do isolated incidents become something more? A scar that doesn't match known species. Tracking data that suggests predation by something larger. Reports, rare but persistent, of massive shapes moving in deep water. Individually, each can be explained away. But together, they form a pattern that's difficult to dismiss entirely. Of course, science moves carefully, and for good reason. Extraordinary claims demand extraordinary evidence. And as of now, there is no definitive proof of unknown megapredators lurking beneath the surface. But there's also a fundamental principle that cannot be ignored. Absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. Especially in an environment as vast and unexplored as the deep ocean. So where does that leave us? Not with answers, but with questions. And perhaps that's more important. Because questions drive exploration. They push us to look deeper, to develop better technology, to challenge assumptions we once considered settled. The ocean, after all, covers more than 70% of our planet. And yet, we've mapped less of it than the surface of the moon. Entire ecosystems exist in darkness, evolving in ways we're only beginning to understand. Creatures with bioluminescence, transparent bodies, unusual hunting strategies, life that seems almost alien. So is it really so far-fetched to think something large, something powerful, could exist beyond our current awareness? The diver who filmed that shark still returns to the water. But something has changed. She describes it not as fear, but as awareness. A subtle shift in perception. Before, the ocean felt like a place she understood, a system with known risks and predictable behaviors. No. It feels deeper. Not just physically, but conceptually. There's a sense that something could be there, just beyond visibility. Not necessarily watching. Not necessarily hunting. Just existing. And that alone is enough to alter how you move, how you think, how you breathe beneath the surface. The captain of the boat, a man who has spent decades at sea, is even more reserved. He doesn't speculate publicly. Doesn't entertain dramatic theories. But when pressed, he offers a single word. Respect. Not fear. Respect for the ocean. Respect for its scale, its complexity, and its capacity to surprise. Because no matter how advanced we become, no matter how much we explore, we are still visitors there. So let's bring it back to you. When you picture a great white shark, what comes to mind? Power, precision, dominance. Now consider something different. What if even that symbol of ultimate predation is part of a larger system, one we don't fully understand? What if the scars they carry are not just remnants of past battles, but clues? Messages, in a way. Evidence of interactions that happen far below the surface, out of sight, beyond reach. And what if, somewhere in that vast darkness, something exists that we've never truly encountered? Not because it's rare, but because we've barely looked. So the next time you think about the ocean's hierarchy, remember that moment. A 15-foot great white, marked by something larger. And ask yourself, if the hunter can become the hunted, what else might be out there? Still hidden, still unknown, waiting just beyond the edge of what we can see. And if one day we do find the answer, will we be ready for it?